It is actually nice to hear you guys sounding so perky.
Yeah, it's good for you. It'll keep you up a little longer, Draguti. Okay, well, let's get on with it then. Welcome, and I'm glad you're participating in this because it gives me another chance to, tiptoe around the wheel and see all the goodies that are there. I'm particularly fascinated by this because I think that it is a subject that not only has it never really been taught or looked at in this way, and the only way that I've ever approached this in the past has been mystically, is that it really represents a deeper level of understanding the way in which the structure itself is set up, that is the structure of life on the planet, and the way in which the planet is programmed. Let me just give you an image. When you're looking at this image, the first thing that I really want you to look at is, when I was first given the knowledge, and I obviously been talking about that a lot recently, one of the areas that was integral to the knowledge and an area that I had literally absolutely no background in was the I Ching. And I've always been somebody who is inspired by what I see. And so for me, the beginning of my investigation of the I Ching was a deep, deep look at each of these strange hexagrams. For me, particularly then, they seemed inscrutable, I guess is a good word. And they became my meditation. It became the focus for me. I would look at them and think about them. And I would see them in their relationship in the wheel. What was next to what? The way in which the patterns worked, because the patterns were so beautiful. The wheel could be seen as divided in half. It could be seen as divided in quarters. It could be seen as divided in eighths, in sixteenths. All you had to do was follow the pattern of the chops, and how perfect they were. That every opposition is this miraculous mirror, truly a mirror, an inside-out mirror. How perfect it was. And I began to notice the obvious. That when the bottom two lines were the same, you were in the same quarter. You just began to see it. And when the bottom three lines were the same, you began to see that they were in the same house, that is, the traditional I Ching of the 8 gates of a house. And then when you saw that the bottom 4 were the same, right beside each other, one after the other, you came to the mystery. For me, this mystery, you see, there is something, when you look at the quarter of a quarter, you're looking at such a deep, deep connection between those elements. And at the moment that you really think about those elements, when you take the 4 gates of a quarter, and you look at them within the body graph, it's quite something to see. It's quite something to understand that the majority of the chemistry, is alike. There is a hidden, if you will, unifying principle in each of these quarters. And this unifying principle of each of these quarters fascinated me. There are 16 quarters. Now, when I was taken through my mystical process, it began with cosmology. It began with a story. And the story in itself was all rooted in the way in which the crystals of consciousness are organized. Anybody that took the band 2 with me, Rave Cosmology 1, obviously something that I went through in great detail. And the graph that you are looking at is a graph that I used, for example, in that Rave Cosmology program as a way of integrating the mystical into what is the Maya mandala that we work with. So I want to take you into this core first, before we go anywhere, so that you have an understanding of what, in fact, you were looking at. Everything about this configuration is about personality programming. Personality programming. And in personality programming, what we are looking at is that we are looking at crystals, and we are looking at crystals that have, let's say, a very large impact on the way in which the program operates. Now, to begin with, there is this triangle in the center. Let me see over here. This triangle in the center. Now, in the case of the personality, there are two centers. There is a personality center. There is a design center. The personality center is called the ban, and the design center is called the two. In this particular case, we would be looking at the ban center. And on either side of that center, because this has to do with the way in which we are programmed here on earth, on either side of that are two very strange things. One is called the camel, and the other is called the dog. These three crystals, the camel and the dog, are crystals that are literally inside of, or a part of, or are through which we receive information from our sun. That is, the star that gives us our life. What we're looking at, in fact, are crystals which are core to the way in which the influence of the sun and the influence of all of the other forces that are part of the programming agency of the planet, the way in which they all work together. See, in order to get to the exoteric of all of this, I have to take you into the deep esoteric of this, and it's very esoteric. So we have these three crystals that are at the core. That is the ban, the camel, and the dog, and this represents, just to keep it simple, this represents the programming of the sun. So here we have the programming of the sun, and we can see that in the box in the center. And then you'll see these numbers, the 1, the 2, the 3, and the 4. These are called corners. I'll get to that later when I change illustrations. These corners are deeply, deeply influential. And each of these corners represents a major physical object, literally. That is, they represent the planet Jupiter. They represent the stars Sirius, Dubhe, and Alcyone. And it is these four, these so-called corners, and if you notice from the names that I just gave you, these are the names of the 4 quarters. In other words, in the mystical language of Rave Cosmology, they are called corners, oddly enough. Of course, in the crystal sense of it, they look like corners, don't they? Sort of, if you know what I mean. But anyway, mystically they're referred to as corners, but what they program are quarters. It's why we say we have the quarter of, Jupiter, the domain of Jupiter, the realm of Jupiter, the realm of Sirius, whatever the case may be. So we have these 3 central crystals, and these 3 central crystals are about solar programming. We have these 4 corners. These are literally the 4 coordinating agencies of the whole program. And then, out of the 4, yes, we get the 16. And that 16 becomes what we will look at. In other words, that this 16, which mystically is referred to as the faces. There are 16 faces. there are originally 16 personality crystal bundles. And these 16 faces are the 16 faces literally of the Godhead. And when you think about it, the expression of any one of the 16 Godheads, that expression is synthesized through the quarter of a quarter, synthesized through the bottom 4 lines, synthesized through what is in fact a common, unique chemistry. See, I'm not so particularly interested in the top 2 lines, because the top 2 lines are only going to let me know what the nuance is of the hand of that God. What I'm interested in is deconstructing those 4 bottom lines to be able to see precisely what the chemistry is of that Godhead. Each and every one of these faces, that the way in which they influence us is that they influence us through the personality crystal bundle. I mean, think about the way everything works. To digress just for a moment. Think about the neutrino stream coming from everywhere. From everywhere. And think about the nature of the earth. I mean, if you could think about the earth, and you could think about crystal personalities, personality crystal bundles, the way in fact they could be seen if we could see them, is in fact it really forms a shell around this earth. And if you go into the earth, you get the design crystal. That is the design crystal bundle, the single crystal bundle. So you've got these 16 variations that are around the outside, all of which are translating neutrino information, and only one unified principle translating unified information. Only one. The design crystal. It's why we must trust the form. It is one of the things that we are here to see, is that we are programmed literally through 16 specific influences. That is the personality. And that there is never truly commonality in that. It is not like they share programming. They each in their own way assume that they are the program. And they don't like the other, so to speak. At least they don't want the other to be more important, to program for them, to influence beyond them. I mean, think about how we get to see this when it's concretized in the world. Think about it. Think about why all religions are based on one thing and one thing only. My God's better than your God. And you know it's true. And it's not because human beings are simpletons. It's because the personality is being programmed by 16 competing forces. They're all competing. And you see, when we begin to find the value of the synthesis in the quarter of the quarter. Hold on a second. Is there anybody else who doesn't have sound? Okay, Elfrida, just refresh then. All right. Okay, I just wanted to make sure, because I did have a server blip and I went out for a second, so sometimes these things happen. I want you to begin to grasp that what we're looking at is that we're looking at a cosmological construct. And what we're trying to come to grips with is, what is the value? I mean, literally, What is the value of each of these faces? When you think about, the human cultural development, and you think about the variations of the themes of the gods. In my office bathroom, I keep a dictionary of the gods. It is both fascinating and amusing. If you go to the index at the back, I think there's a listing of about 300 plus of them. We know from various studies that obviously there are many of these gods that in fact are basically the same. That is, they are recognizable forces, and they're recognizable forces in a different costume. That is, Mercury and Prometheus, these kinds of forces where you get to see that, you change a culture, you've got the same basic dynamic of the force itself, but you end up with a different name. What we're looking for here in our journey, because after all this is an introduction, what we're looking for here is that we're looking for the synthesized quality of each of these Godheads. Their synthesized quality. It is only when we can truly get to, the analytical grasp of what is the basic theme of each of these quarters of quarters. Only then are we going to be able to look out into what time the not-self, cultural diversity has brought, in order finally to be able to assemble these forces into their rightful place, so we can grasp them. There's something else. I guess you must see it, I hope, in a way, that you see it. Is that, you see, once we understand what is the basic quality of each of these 16 faces, it becomes an insight into the way in which a human being is being, mystically programmed by specific forces. I mean, imagine that, your authority is ruled by one God, and your mind is being influenced by another. Now, I don't mean to add unbelievable nuances to any kind of analytical view. And one has to be careful with such things. But it strikes me as interesting. Are we going to find that the believers of a certain synthetic value of Godhead, again, remember, it may not be the specific name, a certain synthetic value, are we going to be able to see in the population why they are fixated on this force or that force? Are we going to be able to see how that chemistry impacts them? How it impacts the way in which that information is carried biologically, generation by generation? I mean, for me, at least, from my perspective, there are fascinating things in here. See, the thing that's most interesting is that they are all in competition with each other. I mean, that's the thing that's so fascinating. And it says something about the way mind is conditioned. It's not like we're all being conditioned by some great, single godly force in which we're inspired by, a single possibility. We're not. We're not. It's why, I get down on my knees to the design. The design is a uniform filter of the neutrino ocean. It is a uniform filter. There is no this or that at all. There is simply the perfection of, whatever level that filtration takes. As in the example of our physical bodies and the extraordinary infrastructure and potential of brain, all this stuff. It's why we always look at the passenger as, a kind of handicapped creature, the passenger has so many problems. It has to deal with openness, it has to deal with the not-self, it has to deal with all of these dilemmas. And on top of that, it is so susceptible to global programming. And global programming is not being run by a democratic committee that is trying to do the best for humankind. It doesn't work that way. It doesn't. They all have their own agenda. Each of the quarters, dominated by the 4 bottom lines, they have their chemical agenda, a very specific agenda. And that's what they're there to get across. They don't want to deal, don't want to be subservient to, don't want to give power to anything else. Anything else. For about, I guess for most of this round, that is, if we go back more than about 10,000 years, we have to go back before Homo sapien had even the beginnings of any kind of civilized direction. We have to go back that far to get to a point in which the personality crystal bundles that move in the environment around us, when they were replenished as they operated. It's something that we talked about in detail in Rave Cosmology in terms of death, dying, and bardo. This is the dilemma of cremating the body right away, or autopsies, or any of these things before the 72 hours after the physical death, is that the personality crystal has no way of returning to its original bundle. Over the last 10,000 years or more, slowly but surely what we've actually had going on is that personality crystals intended for incarnation from bundles have come onto this plane and never returned to the bundle. Out of that, we have had the build-up of what is an enormously overcrowded environment of minor bundles that have taken on, quite an influence in the spiritual, mystical life of humans. The angels and the ghosts and the aliens and the this and the that and all the things that we interpret when we encounter a crystal bundle that is not one of the original 16. By the way, they're dwarfed in size. The original personality crystal bundles are, absolutely enormous in terms of quantity. And it's not like, these bundles that carry 1 million or 50,000 or whatever crystals, that they have somehow, gained some kind of a percentage of weight against the originals. They haven't. But the originals have not been replenished, other than by serendipity, for a very long time. For a very long time. Think about the way that you can see that manifested in the spiritual life of humanity. For example, take Roman Catholicism, and then understand that Roman Catholicism has been splintered into as many sects and denominations, as you want to imagine. I assume there are thousands of them. The Church of Tomorrow and the Day After, the Reverend Jack, whatever the case may be. And you can go from the Reformation, all the way through to the buildup of all of the, Presbyterians and Anglicans and Baptists and on and on and on and on and on. And what you're really seeing is that the original Christ consciousness bundle, it does exist, that bundle which carried that frequency, because there are no returning crystals, that what you have is you have a fragmentation, you have diversification, you have a diminishing of the original force. It's quite something to think about. Because you can't get in this door of the quarters. You will not fully be able to take this in until you can, play with the true mystical side of this, because it is a key in understanding the way in which we are programmed, not the body. Again, the holiness of the unity of the single design crystal bundle. No argument. Just simply a matter of understand how it works and you're free. This is the great liberation that human design brings. It brings the consistency of an absolute in the Maya. And this absolute in the Maya is derived from the fact that we are programmed physically by a single force. A single force, a unifying form principle. There is no such thing for the personality. There isn't. It's why we have this great dilemma in the consciousness of man, human. There is all this diversity, and not only that, the stories aren't clear anymore. They're not. These gods used to be very straightforward and simple. It's not like that anymore. The message that was once so pure as an imprinting force is gone. You see, this is why philosophers who look will see that the first and most natural tendency of human consciousness was to be polytheistic. It simply was. It's a real stretch for humankind to assume that there is one God, because it is not true. It isn't. There are these 16 faces. And I suppose if you want to be cute, you could say that all 16, if you put them all together, that the quantum of that is God. Well, all right, but it's just playing. Because it doesn't really work that way. Because it's not about the one anything. It's not the time for the one anything. Not for the personality. It isn't. See, the truth is that if you can demonstrate, inviolably, if you can demonstrate that there are 16 different ways in which we are programmed, and there is no escape from that, it's another tool to bring the passenger to recognition that it needs to honor the body, that it needs to honor the vehicle. There is where the truth is. And it's not to say that this God is better than that God. But it must be clear, really clear, that these 16 different forces, that they have no interest in the others. They don't. They're only interested in fulfilling what is their mechanic, because after all, it's just another mechanic at work. And the process of going through this is to be able to define what they are. I mean, define them. Put it in perspective. And then try to figure out, how does it work? You know, I was describing in my mystical encounter how within me there was the voices of the planets in the centers. And I described it as being the most disturbing and maddening of experiences. And yet I hope you begin to glimpse that this is what we are like. Because obviously we are not going to be oriented only to one of these faces. We're not. We're going to have a little bit of this and a little bit of that and a little bit of this. And it's going to be in different places in the way in which it works within us. You know, this competition there within each of us, within each of our forms. And all of that feeding our minds. You know, if you look into the writings of all great religious men, women, you will always find a place of their great doubt, their moment of great doubt. You know, like the quote of Jesus on the cross, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? This moment of doubt, deep, deep doubt. There is no one God in us. There isn't. There is a cacophony of agents influencing us. And it is left to our minds to go this way or that. And our minds, as we well know, they have their limitations in the not-self. See, this is something that takes us very, very deep into the way in which we are programmed, and it takes us to a place of grasping helplessness. Helplessness. You know, I love my helpless and incompetent hat. I understand that. I understand how deep it is. I have always realized, always recognized the folly of assuming that everyone can be brought to the same place. You can't. You can't, because we're not made that way. We're not. You see, I've never wanted to threaten in revealing the knowledge of design anybody's religious inclination. It makes no difference to me whether one is caught in the folly of Allah, Yahweh, Jesus, Buddha. I don't care. It's just a costume. What I care about is that cosmology allows those that are ready to see. It's all just a program. It's just a program. It isn't anything else. And that if we are really looking for transcendence, if we are really looking for transformation in this life, then we have to turn inward to our vehicle, It is the only consistency. It is the only consistent truth that there is for us, is our form. And rather than getting into the competition at the personality level of this over that, simply to get to the point where we know what this is and what that is, because it has never had a name. And we'll give it a name. So we have this, we have this magical environment. And we have a magical, mystical environment that literally translates into a program. You see it here in relationship to the quarters themselves. And I'm talking about the larger, the full quarter, not the quarter of the quarter. So that you can see the dividing points here that create each of the quarters. So here we're dealing with, the quarter of initiation, the beginning of the process, the quarter of civilization, the quarter of duality, the quarter of mutation. And that each of these quarters are ruled by a binary chop. And if you look at, the quarter of mutation, you will see that every one of these 16 gates, that the bottom two lines are yang-yang. Yang-yang. What do we know about mutation? What we know is that this is a place in the cycle where the movement towards end and beginning is where the focus is. Continuum. Death, rebirth. Death, resurrection. All of those things. And here we have the purest of the yang. Pure yang-yang. Yet mystically, this is a time in which the quarter of mutation is losing its power. This is when the yang-yang is coming to an end. Now when you think about that, Rave Cosmology 5 that I start teaching on Thursday is about our movement towards the end of this round, and ultimately what I was told by the voice about what comes beyond that. And one of the things that comes beyond that is that there is no end that becomes a beginning. There is no end that becomes a beginning. I was told that at the end of this round that the yang-yang will be culled. And when we are looking at the yang-yang root, we are looking at the oldest source of Godhead. The oldest, deep, ancient force of the Godhead in this quarter. Now again, obviously we are going to see that this quarter, because the quarter itself is a loose configuration of 4 very separate faces. And yet all of them together, regardless, helplessly, carry the yang-yang at their root. And it means literally that all of this is coming to an end. Its true end, with no new beginning. The faces that we will see here, these 4 faces, these are the ancient faces of the Godhead. The most ancient. In other words, these are faces of the Godhead that had influence on our species long before our species could even contemplate it, if I could put it that way. Like fire. But anyway, all right. If we move to its opposite, if we go to the other side, we get to Sione. She is a magnificent star. This is the lead star of what are known as the Pleiades, or mystically as the Seven Sisters. Interestingly enough, Dubhe, which is a star of the Great Bear, in the wagon, whatever you want to call that. In English, still referred to as the Great Bear. The seven brothers, they were known as the seven rishis of the Great Bear and the seven sisters of Alcyone, that these are the only two constellations that are both in the Bhagavad Gita and in the Old Testament. Something to consider about how ancient these forces are. But anyway, Alcyone, obviously this is a great yin star. There are many, many people on this planet who claim to be in contact with Pleiades. I'm sure that some of you have heard about them, the Pleiadians. I mean, there were big books that were sold to huge numbers of people about Pleiadian information. You know, anyone who is going to have that, is going to have that yin down there at the bottom, at the root. These are the great yin faces. The yin faces, as opposed to the other side and the yang. And of course the yin faces are about civilization, the building of the world, the building of the form principle. Building it. As Dubhe is the mind and Alcyone is the body. The great form. And here is where the revival of the form principle is coming from. It's coming from the influence of Alcyone. And obviously, as the yang diminishes in power, the yin grows. It's taken thousands of years for this revelation to finally have its time to reassert the yin. I mean, human design is not yang knowledge. It is yin knowledge, form principle knowledge. And you can see that form principle knowledge, though it has emerged with its own power now, we are still overwhelmed by the dysfunction of the personality yang world that we live in. And the yin isn't going anywhere. It's only going to grow in power. More and more and more until we reach the absolute incredible of what the future holds for us in terms of what form principle is ultimately really going to look like. To the left and the right. The bottom yang and the top yin, top yang, bottom yin on the other side. In the tradition of the I Ching, this is the eldest sister and brother. They carry their own power. These are the second generation Godhead. These are the gods that we know the most. These are the ones that, touch us continually throughout our history. If we go to the yang with the yin on top, Dubhe, the Rishi, the Great Bear. You see, these are the faces of the messengers to humanity. This is the gift of the eldest son. is to not be a black magician. The domain of the Father. The eldest son is here to, rebel and share the secrets that the Father wanted to hold to itself. And so we have the four faces of, those that inspire humanity. But again, it's not a cabal. It isn't. Each quarter has its own story to tell. Truly it does. Each quarter has its own face. Oh, it does. And on the other side, Jupiter, the Logos. All hail Jove, by Jove, Mr. Jovian himself. I'm a great admirer of how extraordinary Jupiter is. I understand it cosmologically. In fact, the whole program on Earth is literally coordinated by Jupiter through its 4 moons. In fact, each of these chops can be seen with each of these, Sirius and Dubhe and so forth, each of them as they relate to the Galilean moons, that is the 4 large moons of Jupiter. It is those moons, through their electromagnetic influence, that they carry with them all the information. This is the global orchestration directories. This incredible name, the gods. It's a great anagram, and Jupiter is truly the Logos, and Jupiter represents the emergence of what are yin forces masked with yang in this time. For example, Pluto. I do not consider Pluto to be yang. I consider Pluto to be yin. I consider Saturn to be yin. As a matter of fact, the yinness of Saturn is so impressive that it's astonishing to me that she's never been caught because she dresses in drag. Anyway, I don't want to get into all that. Nonetheless, we have 4 faces of the yin that are hidden now, only now, and slowly they will break down. Basically the way we get to see that, because of course Jupiter represents the quarter of duality, and it is in this quarter that the engineering of the life program works. Excuse me. Sorry about that. This hidden yin, we see it in relationships between men and women in the West now. That is, what we have referred to since the beginning of the 60s as the women's revolution, or, any of those names, feminist revolution, blah, 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 all that stuff, whatever the cliches are. Fact is, it all took place since basically 1961, when we entered into a first-line theme, and the key became 61-1, and inner truth had to come out, and at the core of inner truth is the yin-yin. This is a time for the emergence of the power of the female. Now, obviously, the example of the West is not sufficient to say that this is any more than a trend. We still see that the yin is overwhelmed by the yang. That is, we still see that the vast majority of females on this planet, particularly female children, are disadvantaged in this life. And this is something that is slowly changing. These faces are very important. There's a term, a nasty term, that emerged in the United States in people who didn't like homosexuals. They would reveal them. In other words, some famous person that's found out to be gay, and all of a sudden it would be on the internet, and they would have to deal with all the consequences. Well, I want to tell you that these four faces, they need to be brought out of the closet. They really need to have, their yang mask taken off. And the fact is that it's coming. And it is outed. That's the word. Yes, thank you, Jagrudi. They need to be outed. There's a lot of them in there that really, those four faces are going to be very, very interesting for us to take a look at. I wanted to give you a sense today of the mystical of this, because we're really going to get into a very straightforward analytical process as we move along. But today is a day that I needed to set the tone for you, because I want you to know where I am in this. At one level you can go through this program and be extremely well educated in the wheel, which is, a byproduct of this, and so it should be. But at another level, this is very much deeper. And that it only becomes deeper when you're working with the inner synthesis yourself. In other words, when you're, as we move through this process, that you begin to look for what is that face. And that face on the outside, and that face on the inside. It is going to be interesting. I want to show you where we're going to start. And we're going to begin here. It is not, as you will see, a natural place to begin. And it is not a natural place to begin. I'll go back a step. It is not a natural place to begin because that, in fact, is not the first quarter. You can see that. Here's the... Let me show that the other way. Here's the 13. Here's the beginning of the first face, if we're going this way. And its relationship is in fact to what is called the fifth face. The first face is over here. It's the beginning of Scorpio. So we're not going to start with the first face. Now, by the way, that is something that I am doing intentionally, and intentionally in the sense that I want to take us through the way in which the quarters are structured, because this is the correct dynamic, but also to understand what I told you about the yang-yang. In other words, that this is coming to an end, and I would like to leave what is coming to an end until the end. And we won't get there until next semester, but nonetheless, this will be the end of our story. We're going to begin here. We're going to begin in the quarter of initiation, in the quarter of mind. We're going to begin in the realm of Dubé. We're going to begin with this process. So when we move over here and we look at that, again you can see here is, for example, here is where we're going to see the very first quarter. And it's going to begin with the 13, so we're looking at the 13, we're looking at the 49, the 30, and the 55. And then you look, and you come over here to the, to the chop, and you see this magic. I mean, it's really just magic. It's just the same. These four bottom lines. It's so beautiful to look at the way in which it works. And where our focus is going to be is that we are deeply going to go in here. And when you think about this quarter, it's not just this synthesis that we're looking for out of these four bottom lines that are going to carry this same unique chemistry, that have exactly the same binary couplets, the yang with the yin on top and then a double yang. And we're going to be able to see that we're going to begin to be able to bring analytical interpretation to these couplets. That they mean something. We already have seen what the yang-yang by itself means when it's at the root. We're going to see the yang-yang here in the middle. In other words, we have combinations here that are going to give us analytical tools. We also get to see it in the body graph. And that we can see that in the body graph, here's the 13 in the G, and down here you have the rest of them, in the emotional system. All pointed downwards. And isn't it interesting just to think about those 4 bottom lines, these 3 gates. You can see their similarity. Isn't it obvious, their similarity? Yes. And the 13? And what does the 13 do? It reveals. It carries the secrets. And what secrets does it know? It knows these secrets. You know? I mean, this is, it's magic. So we have a wonderful journey in front of us. And when we come back next week, we are going to tackle our very first quarter. The other thing is that we're going to look at these quarters in terms of their chemistry as well. We're going to look at them in terms of their codon relationship. We're going to look at them in terms of the values that are there. We're going to look at it holistically. In other words, from every perspective that we can look at, and begin our process of seeing if we can integrate all of that into a whole. It should be quite... Jupiter is duality. And Sirius is mutation, coming to an end. Anyway, so we have an interesting journey in front of us. Why don't you say... hold on, Kathy. Kathy's brought up a point that perhaps I have made some kind of horrendous mistake here. No. I'll check that, Kathy. I'll get back to you. Stay with what we've got. Okay, so for all of you, welcome to the beginning of our journey, and I certainly look forward to plowing through our chopping. Yes, we will do our chopping. We're going to go God chopping, and it's very sweet that we're all back together again. And let's enjoy our next 11 weeks. Okay, until next time. Bye for now.